Imagine being so good, so pure, so hopelessly honest that your very existence makes an entire city go mad. You smile, people panic. You speak, scandals begin. You try to help, someone ends up dead. This is the story of The Idiot by Fyodor Dostoevsky. When it was first published, this novel was extremely criticized. Some even said it was the worst Dostoevsky has ever written. The plot is confusing, unbalanced, too long. While reading, you feel sometimes almost in an atmosphere of an endless nightmare. Nevertheless, this book is considered today one of the greatest works of literature. So, how is this possible? Dostoevsky gives us a hint in a letter. What most people call the fantastic and exceptional is for me the most profound reality. It is not the novel I value the most, but the idea. In this video, we will attempt to explore exactly this idea that made this novel one of the most profound ever written. In January 1868, the newspaper The Russian Messenger began publishing Dostoevsky's The Idiot. Dostoevsky would later say he had never had a richer subject, and yet he could not express even a tenth of what he wanted to say. Prince Mishkin, epileptic, orphan, a man with nothing but a bundle of personal belongings, returns to Russia from a Swiss clinic where a professor had treated him out of charity. He is 27 years old, but according to the doctor, he is still a child in soul, a child in intelligence. He has spent his life outside apart from utility and egoism, and now he steps into a city full of predators, sensualists and drunks. Basically a lamb walking into the marketplace of wolves. His first stop is General Epanch's house, a distant relative of his. And from the very first moments, Mishkin's awkwardness shows itself. He talks too much to the footman, says the wrong things to the secretary, and breaks a Chinese vase during a particularly emotional speech. This image of the Chinese vase breaking apart perfectly represents what happens when idealism collides with reality. It breaks. And yet, nobody truly hates him for this. They laugh, of course, but they forgive him, as one forgives the mistakes of a traveler from some distant land, because they sense something. He's not one of them. He doesn't belong to their language, their laws, and perhaps that's exactly what makes him fascinating. Mishkin is defined in the title of the novel as an idiot, but he doesn't possess less intelligence. He just possesses a different type of intelligence. The beautiful General Epanch's daughter, Aglaya, introduces this different type of intelligence, telling to the prince the following words. Principal intelligence is more developed in you than in anyone else. You possess it to a degree they've never even dreamed of seeing. But what is this principal or primary intelligence? It is that deep, intuitive wisdom born of feeling. It is a gift and a curse at the same time. And it opposes to the secondary intelligence, which is the rational, self-serving logic of society. We could try to see the whole novel as a single profound tension. What happens when pure goodness walks into a world ruled by calculation and reason? When principal intelligence collides with secondary intelligence. Principal intelligence lives outside the ordinary laws of cause and effect. It doesn't argue, it feels. It sees through contradiction, through the fragile walls of morality. And when it enters a world obsessed with appearances and control, it does what innocence always does. It disturbs everything. Mishkin's arrival is met with laughter. He is called naive, foolish, grotesque, etc. But slowly something begins to shift. Now the point is, how can someone so powerless make others question everything they believe in? In Dostoevsky's novel, the weak man tames the strong, not with force, but with faith. And Mishkin's secret is that he's convinced that everyone around him is capable of kindness. And because he believes it, for a moment they begin to act as if it were true. And this is how everyone around him slowly starts changing. The proud discovers humility, the selfish feels remorse, the cynic remembers what it was like to be an innocent person. His presence is like a light passing through a darkened room. It doesn't stay forever, but it leaves a trace that once seen cannot be forgotten. And here I'd like to introduce an interesting paradox. Those who feel his influence most deeply are not the common people, but rather the rotten fruits of the society. And who are those people? Rogozin, the brute who will later kill the woman he loves, and Natasha Filipovna, the fallen beauty, burning with shame and pride. Why do they understand him the most? Because they've already stepped beyond the walls of conventional morality. They have sinned, they have suffered, and they have felt. And if you read a bit of Dostoevsky, you will for sure recognize that in his universe, passion stands closer to truth than indifference. But besides these doomed characters, another group of people is moved by Mishkin kindness: the children. Because they are the ones who haven't yet been shaped by the machinery of reason, ambition, or pride. Their hearts are still open, their minds still fluid. They live close to what is real, close to the divine. Of course, later they will grow into respectable adults, trained to conform and forget. But for now, they remain free. And because they are still free, they understand him very well. In some sense, Mishkin is also one of them. A child lost in the court of adults. At some point of the story, he says, "Adults don't know that even in the most difficult matter, a child can give advice of extreme importance. When that graceful little bird looks at you with such trust and happiness, you'd be ashamed to deceive him." Meanwhile, the so-called intellectuals, the wise men, build their fortress of truth so high they cannot even longer see the sky. Their own pride blocks the light. And as the Gospel says, it has hidden from the wise and the intelligent what it has revealed to children. Among all those rebels, all those who refuse to be contained by society's logic, there is a kind of a mysterious brotherhood. They are united not by some kind of ideology, but by the feeling, by an invisible thread, like a telepathic current running beneath the surface. They can sense things before they happen. They know. They don't predict. They feel the future pressing against them. Mishkin is one of these beings. For example, when someone asks whether Natasha Filipovna will marry Rogozin, he simply answers, "Yes, I believe he will marry her tomorrow," and murder her 8 days later. There is just something in the air, a misfortune flying low like a bat in the night, but nothing can be done to stop it. And this is how this gift of knowledge turns into a curse. Because what is the use of foreseeing the future if you cannot change it? Natasha senses what's going to happen. Rogozin knows it. Mishkin as well. So the tragedy doesn't arrive as a surprise. And it's not opposed like we would see by Greek tragedies, for example in the Oedipus the King. In Dostoevsky's universe, the tragedy is foreseen and embraced. Mishkin notices a knife on Rogodzin's table and knows, without any explanation, that it will be the weapon. He walks toward disaster because it is already written in the air around him. And when this disaster happens, Rogodzin waits for him outside, not because he's being called, but because he knows he will come. This is a common motif of Dostoevsky's characters. They know their fate, they feel the abyss opening before them, and yet they walk toward it willingly. And they are not guided by reason or by a hunger for intensity. They do not seek peace, they seek to exist fully, completely. So we could turn the famous saying by the philosopher Descartes, "I think, therefore I am," into "I suffer, therefore I am. I overcome torments, therefore I will be." So the Dostoevsky's characters don't long for salvation, but for clarity that only suffering can bring. And this is why the novel is a bit confusing and moves like a chain of catastrophes. Every disaster is foreseen, none is avoided. We could resume the whole plot as follows. Mishkin enters the General Epanchin's household and immediately gets entangled in intrigues that don't belong to him. He decides to marry Natasha Filipovna out of compassion after seeing only a picture of her. He competes with Rogozin knowing the outcome. Natasha walks toward her own death knowing it's inevitable. And Rogozin kills her, even though he knows perfectly that he will regret it forever. And then they meet over her body, the murderer and the saint, not as enemies, but as two men who have touched the same terrible truth and who are part of the same tragedy. And what happens when they meet? Nothing. Mishkin doesn't say anything. He just trembles, touches Rogodzin's head gently. That's all he can do. In Dostoevsky's word, desire is never fulfilled. Passion is always torn. And in this universe, the women play a very important role. A woman in Dostoevsky's novel is never the resting place of the soul. On the contrary, she represents the spark, the catalyst, that throws men outside moral law and into the raw air of freedom. Unlike, for example, other Russian classics like Tolstoy's Anna Karenina or Pushkin's Tatiana, Dostoevsky's women are never the center of his novel, but rather forces that awaken, wound, lift, and destroy. Often, one woman stands between two men, or a man loves two women. Each love splits the soul in two. Usually it's between the love of the body and the love of the soul. In The Idiot, Mishkin loves Aglaya for her beauty, but when he first encounters Natasha and sees her face, her sad eyes full of sorrow, he can't help but to feel impassion or pity for this unfortunate woman. He says in the book, "I couldn't bear her face. I don't love her with love, but with pity." Natasha became an orphan at a very young age, and her wealthy guardian, Totsky, forced her into a 4-year relationship as his concubine when she was only 16. This experience ruined her life and left her feeling permanently corrupted and unworthy of happiness. Because of this story, the entire society regards her as a fallen woman, and Natasha has internalized this judgment, believing herself to be guilty and deserving of punishment. She is constantly torn between the knowledge of her inner innocence, affirmed more times by the Prince Mishkin, and her fervent belief in her own guilt and corruption. This conflict, combined with a desire for revenge, drives her to behave in a destructive and scandalous way, making her flee from the pure, compassionate love of Prince Mishkin toward the passion, the violent obsession of Rogozin, which she knows will ultimately lead her to death. Only the prince's love could save Natasha from her lowering herself. But this love is too close to compassion to satisfy her. She is too proud. She does not accept pity. And out of reaction, she becomes attached to her dishonor, which prevents her from being loved as she desires. There is a famous scene where Aglaya tells her something very true. You can only love your own shame. The insensate idea that you are lost and that someone has made you a ruined woman. If you were less tarnished or not at all, you would be more happy. And she's right. Natasha loves her fall. She loves the mirror of her own ruin. She consents to humiliation, but she refuses to be humiliated. If you think about it, this is a very common motif by Dostoevsky's characters. And I think the reason is that they use their fall, their unfortune, as a sign of rebellion against God and divine. Because their life is unfortunate and it is miserable, they have nothing. The only thing that they have, that they possess, is their misery. And this misery becomes a sign of existence. By many Dostoevsky's characters, there is always this tension between falling and seeking for a salvation. The problem is that even though they long for this salvation, they cannot bear to receive it. They cannot accept it. For Dostoevsky, earthly love isn't meant to replace the divine. Rather, it is the profound, shattering force that shakes the human soul and prepares it for a higher love that will not disappoint. Prince Mishkin doesn't act, he simply loves. Yet, When he attempts to translate his pure passion into concrete action, he destroys what he touches. His presence accelerates a murder, several family disasters, and his own ultimate descent into madness. He is unable to adapt his pure nature to the corrupting realities of the human condition. Nevertheless, and here comes an important point, his suffering and loss have a higher purpose. They serve to awaken a form of tragic realization in those he leaves behind. In the Gospel of John from the Bible, we read the secret conclusion of the idiot. Truly, truly, I say to you, unless a grain of wheat falls into the earth and dies, it remains alone, but if it dies, it bears much fruit. Prince Mishkin is perhaps the least human character Dostoevsky ever created. In his other great novel, The Brothers Karamazov, we find a similar character, Alyosha Karamazov. Alyosha is a young man who is good and pure, but who at the same time knows also evil, temptation, and passion. He understands their weight and he resists them. In this sense, he is a complete being, anchored in the world. But Mishkin, well, Mishkin belongs somewhere else. He carries the body of a man, but the soul of something unearthly. He has no sensuality. He cannot desire as other men desire. So this saint had to be anchored to the earth somehow. Otherwise he would simply float above the novel. And so Dostoevsky gives him something real, something terrifying, his own illness. Mishkin is indeed an epileptic, just like Dostoevsky. And with that illness comes a gift and a curse. Moments before the seizure, he experiences what Dostoevsky himself called the highest moment of harmony. There is a point in which Mishkin says, "At that moment, I think I understand the apostle's extraordinary word. There shall be no more time." In those brief flashes, the world reveals its perfect order. Time stops. Every boundary, body, distance, suffering dissolves. He sees not the world as it is, but as it could be. But what happens when a man lives half in heaven and half in hell? When reality is transparent to him, but reality cannot bear his gaze. Dostoevsky doesn't just project his thoughts onto Mishkin, he gives him his own memories. The story Mishkin tells of the condemned man awaiting execution, the unbearable 20 minutes between death sentence and pardon, is Dostoevsky's own story. In 1849, he stood himself before a firing squad. The command was given, rifles were raised, and then the pardon came. That quarter of an hour lived between death and salvation never left him. It became Mishkin's memory. Another interesting autobiographical fact is referred to Holbein's painting, The Body of the Dead Christ in the Tomb. By the way, it is a very impressive painting that you can see today in the Museum of Basel. In the novel, the painting hangs in Rogojin's house. Mishkin says, "Looking at this painting, a man could lose his faith." Anna Grigorievna, Dostoevsky's wife, recounts how her husband stood before that very painting as they were in Basel, and he was paralyzed, trembling. His face was frozen in that terror she recognized as the onset of his seizures. A Christ without glory, without resurrection, a body already decomposing. This image shook the foundation of his faith, and in the novel it shakes the fragile faith of the prince. Around Mishkin, Rogojin and Natasha, around this triangle of love, death and ruin, another word swarms. A noisy, grotesque, tragic chorus of parasites and dreamers. There is, for example, General Evolgin, who lies compulsively so much that he can no longer distinguish reality from the fiction he invents. There is then General Epanchin, important and humiliated, remains a rejected admirer of Natasha. And we have Aglaya, brilliant, cruel, vulnerable, laughs at Prince but secretly adores him. And then there is Hippolyte, the dying young man, the one who has only a handful of days left, but demands to be heard. Through his character, Dostoevsky asks the most unbearable question of all. What is the ultimate meaning of life? Hippolyte stands at the edge between thought and matter, between miracle and machine, between hope and the absolute silence of the universe. He remembers the painting in Rogojin's anteroom, Holbein's Christ in the tomb, and he says, Christ's face is atrociously disfigured by blows. The wounds are swollen, the eyes glassy, dead. And a strange question arises. How could anyone looking at this body believe in resurrection? His question is provocative, and it goes straight to the point. If even he, Christ, the one who made nature obey, was crushed at the end by its laws, what chance does anyone else have? For Hippolyte, this is the ultimate scandal. Death reigns over everything. Faith has already lost, not at the empty tomb, but at the moment the body fell from the cross. And so he rages against what we would call the prime mover, the cold, indifferent force that devours both innocent and guilty, genius and fool, saint and criminals. And he says, You can't devour me and demand that I bless the one who devours me. But think about it for a second, because this character is quite important and interesting, and he has a certain point. I mean, if he blasphemes, if he errs, how can he be guilty for failing to understand the incomprehensible? How can one blame a man for drowning in a sea that no reason can cross? And Dostoevsky, of course, knows that this attack cannot be answered with logic. Faith isn't built like a geometric proof. It's not deduced, it's felt, it's lived. And so, when Hippolyte asks Prince Mishkin to explain the meaning of life, the prince doesn't argue, he simply replies, Go your way and forgive us our happiness, because not every question can be solved. Some must be simply lived through. Mishkin, with his pureness, represents the seed that will open a possibility for a better future. His innocence doesn't defeat evil with power, it outlives it. It prepares the soil for something greater, something that may come after him. Because innocence is not weak. It is the quiet force that cracks stone over time. It doesn't argue with darkness, it exposes it and forgives. Forgiveness is the most divine act of all. To forgive not just a slight, not just a betrayal, but the one who took from you the most precious thing. To forgive the hand that destroys you and still love. So Mishkin is not a failed savior. He is a livable parable. He shows that even in a corrupted world, an angel can live. That innocence can exist, even if only for a moment. And that moment is enough to change everything that will follow. Thank you for watching this video. I'm Ivan, and this is Empyreon, the Academy of Philosophy and Fine Arts.